Okay, thank you. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Patricia Hampl to you this evening. She's a fellow Minnesotan whose work I have admired since the 70s when she was involved at the Loft, which is a writer's center in Minneapolis, where I began to learn what it meant to be a writer. I was one of those wannabe hippies, and she was a bona fide hippie. She has gained international acclaim for both her poetry and memoir writing. Four of her books have been named Notable Books of the Year by the New York Times Book Review. She received many other awards and fellowships, including a MacArthur Fellowship in 1990. She is a McKnight Distinguished Professor at the University of Minnesota, where she teaches in the MFA program. A Romantic Education, Patricia Hampl's memoir about her Czech heritage, launched her career in 1981 and established her as an influential figure in the rise of autobiographical writing in the last 25 years. Following this, she published Virgin Time, her memoir about her Catholic upbringing. She has published two collections of poetry, Woman Before an Aquarium and Resort and Other Poems. Accompanied by engravings by the artist Stephen Sorman, who I recently heard is in town, she wrote a remarkable book titled Spillville, which is a meditation on Antonin Dvorak's summer spent in Iowa. Other of her books, whose titles tell you much, include I Could Tell You Stories, Sojourns in the Land of Memory. That's a single title. It was published in 1991. And Blue Arabesque, A Search for the Sublime, published in 2004. The latter was chosen for the Best Spiritual Writing of 2005. Her most recent book, The Florist's Daughter, published in 2007, is a moving tribute to her parents, Stan and Mary Hampl. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune describes it this way. In her lovely elliptical memoir, A Family in Loss, Hampl brings her late mother and father back to life, then gently lays them to rest again. This beautiful bouquet of a book commemorates them both. Patricia has agreed to sign books following the short question and answer period, so please take this opportunity. We're so fortunate to have Patricia Hampl with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, it's a great joy to be here. You've got a few more leaves and a lot more color than we do in Minnesota. Last week I was in Fairbanks, Alaska, and so I do feel a little liberated to be back where it isn't below zero. I too have many thanks. I would like to thank, of course, Tony and Linda for making possible this series and allowing me to be part of it. Really means a lot to be able to come to read to people who might not otherwise know my work, including the conscripts who are here from your English classes. I am grateful for all of you, and to Pamela Lubke and to John Taylor, who are all making this a delightful time. I'm going to read, on the request of Linda, actually, I rarely get asked to read my poems. I'm sure there's a reason for that. But I've been asked by Linda if I would read a couple poems, and I can't resist, of course, doing that. And especially after reading some of hers this afternoon. And so I want to say, Girl, You Do Glow, which is a literary reference to one of her poems, the last actually in her book, The Amber Necklace of Gdansk. This poem actually is yet more in the spirit of the friendships that happen between and among writers, because we sustain each other. You're not all out there buying books all the time the way we would have you do, and so we have to encourage each other, and so we become friends, I think, in a very special way. This poem is called Last Letter, and it's for an old friend of mine who died too young. His name was James White, and the poem takes place at the North Shore of Lake Superior, where I was spending my summers in those years, and I had just heard of his death. But I don't read it only as an elegy, but also as a kind of statement about the solidarity amongst poets. Last letter. Everything is more beautiful today. I'm sorry it's not right when you're dead for the first time this morning. But the rain hits the black asphalt like a hoofer, exhausted, heavy under the transparent strokes of dance. The pink geraniums. Do you like pink? I want to know if you like pink. Are hanging in a basket from the cafe awning, as dry as tissue paper in a package. The lights of things have turned on more intensely just now as yours has clicked immaculately off. The women at the next table are saying something is cute, real cute. One of them with earrings the shape of hearts. No way would I follow that oaf around like she did. They're talking about love, the only subject, darling, except for this new one of yours. Here's what I meant to do. Call you this weekend, go for chicken salad sands at the Sky Room, and you'd whisper again the truth. The really great waitresses always chew gum. You approved of their dismissal of us, charmed always by any artist who couldn't be charmed. You posed glamour as the first honor of friendship, and we said darling to each other, like movie stars. Your white, naughty smile. Tell me again, Trish, darling, how we're going to claw our way to the top. The woman with the hearts at her ears is saying that after 30 years of marriage you can't expect, and that the girl wasn't a gold digger. She says when you order prime rib, you just better not think you're going to get it medium rare. But the only words today are endearments, darling, sweet angel one, caro, caro. We like to be affected and spoke all languages for their flair. Just this instant, a cat streaked by outside, wet and matted as carpeting in a vestibule. His brown and black stripes were green in the rain. A green cat, Jim. Bet you never saw that. And the hearts are gold, pressed tight against each lobe, not hanging, in case you thought I meant the hanging kind. No, pressed like two kisses. And she's looking at the cat, too. She may be thinking about the cat or about something else. I can't say for sure. I'll keep describing things, getting the colors right, taking down the dialogue, packing the report with metaphor so it's art, watching the world be unlikely and eccentric. I call it honesty, as you do. But today, I call it keeping you alive just a little longer, using the present tense, though that's dishonest now, and it is unholy, darling, to hold you a second longer than you held on to us. Perhaps the reason I quit writing poetry is because I had a penchant for the rather depressing occasion, and here's yet another one, although it ends well. This is much shorter, and then I'll move on to prose, where I've been living all these years. This one's called The Moment, and it's a very Minnesota poem, you can tell because there's slush in it. The Moment. Standing by the parking ramp elevator a week ago, sunk, stupid with sadness, black slush puddled on the cement floor, the place painted a killer pastel as in an asylum. A numeral 1, big as a person, was stenciled on the cinder block. Remember your level. The toneless bell sounded, doors opened, nobody inside. Then, who knows why, a rod of light at the base of my skull flashed to every outpost of my far-flung body. I've got my life back. It was nothing, just the present moment occurring for the first time in months. My head translated light, my eyes spiked with tears. The awful green walls, I could have stroked them. The dirt, the moving cube I stepped into, it was all beautiful, everything that took me up. The rest of what I'm going to read to you tonight is from the book that Marian so kindly mentioned in her lovely introduction. Although, what on earth am I doing in a black suit if I started out as a hippie? I don't know. I used to be able to sit on my hair, but that was then. I'm going to read to you, jumping a bit, to set this up. This book is set on the night my mother died, my father already being dead. He was a florist. And the whole book takes place that night in her hospital room with memories coming in, intruding, and kind of bouncing off the window, you might say, the blank, dark window of that night screen. And I will end with one of those memories from my father's flower shop. For once, no flowers. Past midnight and very quiet along this corridor. The clock on the opposite wall is round, a cartoon clock. Funny, the idea of keeping time, here of all places. Beneath the clock, a square calendar announces in bold what is now the wrong date, April 3rd. I could walk over just a few steps, tear the page away from the calendar, and make it today, April 4th. But that would cause a ripping sound, and I'd have to let go of her hand. So leave it. In this room, it's yesterday. We won't reach today until this is over, the time warp we entered 3 days ago. She'd appreciate that, irony being her last grasp on reality. This time, the doctor said in the hallway last night, it might have been 2 nights ago, you understand this time, this is it. 5 years ago, I had faced him wild-eyed in the ER after her first stroke. What do you want us to do? He had asked then. What do I want you to do? I have a graduate degree in lyric poetry. What do I know? But I heard myself say, treat her like a 16-year-old who's just crashed on her boyfriend's motorcycle. And they did. The whole high-tech array of surgical, medical, therapeutic systems revved into high gear. But this time, I don't try to save her. I look at the doctor, by now my accomplice, and I say, oh, yes, when he says, you understand, this is it. Eager to prove myself no trouble, a maker of no fuss. Not something she could be accused of. I get the feeling your mother doesn't like me, he confided a year ago, this mild man of goodwill and even better bedside manner. I walk in the room and she scowls as if she hates me. You got that right. I experience a surge of perverse pride at her capacity to alienate those with power over her. The self-immolating integrity of her fury, her essential unfairness, throwing guilt like a girl, underhand. For her, no such thing as an innocent bystander. Cross her path, and the poisoned dart springs from the quiver of her heart. The look, narrowed eyes, pinched, disdainful mouth, brilliant mime of venomous dislike. I know it well, doctor. You goody two-shoes, she spit out once when I was cleaning her apartment, mopping up cigarette ash around her chair. She didn't bother to disguise her contempt for me as a non-smoker, obviously. I didn't know how to enjoy life. But that sour face of her elderly fury keeps disappearing, just as she is disappearing. Even this latest face, the one propped on the hospital pillow, the hieratic vision that seems polished and soon will be an object, even this one is hard to keep in focus. I'm sitting here holding her hand, but it's the ardent face from 1936 that keeps appearing, the face in the photograph placed on the shelf above the piano all the years of my girlhood and beyond. Heart-shaped, with high cheekbones and eyes set wonderfully wide, it is the face of a romantic lead. Not because she was beautiful. She wasn't beautiful. She was seriously pretty, the way Scott Fitzgerald described the real heartbreakers. The slightly dazzled eyes, she refused to wear her glasses, looked out with a shyness clearly feigned. That was the entrancing part. You could tell she wasn't really shy. She was happy, and a little startled by it. She couldn't keep the happiness of her body and soul off her face. Neither could my father, because of course he's standing next to her, though not yet my father, not yet her husband. Both of them gazed directly at the camera, standing by a cottonwood tree on a sandy bank by the Mississippi. Springtime from the look of the tree, site of a picnic, no doubt. She slouches her trim self stylishly, just touching his lean body. A claim being made. She's happy, and he looks proud. They both have that slightly abashed shyness stamped on their faces, good lookers. They're stepping into their future. He in an open-neck shirt, she in joggers and a little leather jacket. It's their first picture together. I stared at it all my girlhood as if at a problem to be solved. Who are these people? While I tooled my way through a Chopin mazurka, a Bach prelude, under the erotic glory of two kids crazy in love who looked down from another planet, not the one we inhabited together, Mother, Dad, Peter, me, in our bungalow on Linwood Avenue. The nurses can set up a cot for you, the doctor said last night. The low cot is wedged next to her now. I'm perched on the edge, barely hoisted above the floor, a supplicant crouched below the elevated royal bed. I gaze up at the tiny body, the porcelain face. There's a yellow legal pad on my lap. I'm a note-taker from long habit. It's her habit, in fact, one I borrowed or inherited or stole from her. Note-taking, newspaper clipping, file-making, all the librarian traits of wordiness and archival passion she displayed. Her favorite books were biographies. How smoothly the past tense inserts itself already. Big thumpers of Dolly Madison and Abigail Adams on the American history side, Parnell and Wolfe Tone for the Irish obsession. And now on the yellow legal pad, the beginning of hers. Hampl, Mary Marm, age 85. Mary Catherine Ann Teresa Eleanor Marm Hampl, born July 26, 1917 in St. Peter, Minnesota, to Martha Smith and Joseph Marm. That's as far as I've gotten, having made the first artistic decision, loading on all the pretty names. They make her sound like a crowned head. I always wondered if she conferred most of them on herself. I should probably put in her astrological sign. She was always glad to give it, raising her flyaway mane imperiously above her petite frame to say, I'm Leo, the lion. She liked to read my horoscope aloud, placid Pisces, in the morning, after she read hers, and my father's, and my brother's, both the bull as men should be, to see how we were all doing, cosmically speaking. Too bad, she would say sympathetically, after giving me the wan future Jean Dixon so often predicted for my watery self. Not until the night nurse stops in and glances down does it occur to me that composing my mother's obit with my left hand as I hold her unconscious hand with my right might strike an outsider as offensive. Not to her, I want to protest. She would have expected nothing less. The dutiful writer, daughter, scribbling in the half-light, holding the dying hand, while hitting all the high points of her subject's life that is finally going to see print. For a great reader, this is a great death. For years now, I've sat in doctors' offices waiting for my father or my mother as they are dealt with by their medical handlers. I read magazines I would never read otherwise, Ladies' Home Journal, Family Circle. I seem to zero in on the articles on parenting, a word my own parents never used. Relentlessly bland narratives, replete with common sense or its obverse, tedious reassurance. I read them with rapt attention, especially those on the rebellious adolescent child, I who have no children. It is natural, also inevitable, I read again and again, that a child must grow away from, reject is the preferred word, the parent. It's the backdrop of the deeply held postmodern faith, the religion of self-realization I've tried to practice all my adult life. You must abandon ship in order to what? To exist, to be a self. Becoming a person is the point. Being a child, a daughter, it's an interim position, a stunted condition. I've sat in the cardiologist's waiting room, the neurologist's waiting room, attentively reading therapeutic bromides as if I might finally get the message. Somewhere along the line, it seems I neglected to break away. I remained the daughter. Boy, I don't envy you, my oral surgeon brother says from his safe perch on the West Coast where he's lived for years. Still holding her hand now, I glance away from the figurine my mother has become. I turn to the big window that is black and gives me nothing but my own face. Then I turn to the walls, the cartoon clock, the square calendar, the full compass of these days in this shadowy room. I'm waiting for light to break. It'll be another long night. The last one, probably. But I'm still stuck, gazing at their faces that peer back, mute and demanding, from the wedding album, from the piano, where I only seem to be practicing Chopin, gazing back at their mysterious faces that should have been the most familiar faces in the world to me. Nothing is harder to grasp than a relentlessly modest life. Leo the lion settled into her job at a college library, glorying in her proximity to books. You really ought to think of library science, she kept saying whenever I made my claim about wanting to be a writer. In spite of their mutual reverence for education that amounted almost to a cult, my father was asking me what I had learned today long after I was out of graduate school. Working holidays at the flower shop, they agreed, was a good thing. It would not be a good thing to be a waitress, nor would my father allow me to take typing in high school. These activities could lead to unfortunate results: rudeness and fanny pinching, waitressing, or a desk job, typing. For typing was the road to office servitude for unfortunate girls without fathers watchful enough to direct them to a real education that in turn would lead to a non-desk job, though he was vague about what a non-desk job might be. He doesn't want you to end up a file clerk in the office, my mother said, like me. During school breaks and summer vacations, my brother was assigned to work with the growers in the greenhouse or on the delivery routes. My father expected me to know the names of plants and to get a sense of the horticultural side of things, but it was understood I was meant for the downtown store, in retail, where the clerks dressed in gowns they bought on fantastic markdowns from tips passed them by their clerk pals at Frank Murphy and Field Schlick, the best stores in St. Paul. Doctors and lawyers from nearby offices came into the showroom on their lunch hour to order flowers for their wives, usually their wives. A dozen long-stemmed American beauties off-season in a box with a card and a sealed envelope paid for cash, delivery to some apartment on Randolph, not the man's Lincoln Avenue address. You figure it out. But let's get specific. The history of innocence would be incomplete without this moment. Christmas Eve, the final mad dash of the holiday, and we could count on some of our favorites showing up. These were men racing in from a quick stop at Frank Murphy, carrying shiny black boxes with big pink bows, the Murphy insignia. Ours was the silky powder pink box with the firm's name cast across it in gold script like a line from the Declaration of Independence. These last customers of the holiday were classicists, men who bought cashmere cardigans at Frank Murphy and roses and chocolates from us. They came slouching in with their camel's hair coats open. They could leave their shopping to the last minute because their wives had already bought everything for the holiday. All these husbands had to do was make a lavish gesture for the wives. We awaited them at the big marble clerk's table with our pale green order books and our utter exhaustion. Latecomers, they were the easy ones. They'd take anything. And in he walked, 15 minutes before closing, an officer of the Navy, shoulders squared, a commanding face already slightly impatient. I'd never seen him before. Being in uniform, he was certainly from out of town, but he headed straight for our table as if he knew his way around, a man with a mission, my kind of customer. I dipped past the table and made for him before anyone else could claim him. I Didn't often get a chance like this. The clerks didn't work on commission, but none of the big customers, the happy spenders, came to me. If Ollie and Mrs. Butler, the main clerks, were busy, their good customers waited for them, wandering around, idly turning over Hummel figurines to check the prices, inspecting the candy counter, putting their faces down to a gardenia's matte petals. Then Ollie or Mrs. B would race over, apologizing for the wait. Sometimes, if a regular customer was in a hurry, he might turn to me, standing at the table in my blue and white serge convent school uniform, and say, not bothering to disguise his disappointment, "I suppose you could take care of this." But for the most part, I spent my time with the one poinsettia cash and carry crowd who streamed anonymously in and out during the holiday. My father had told me to treat everyone the same. He knew the arch manner of Ollie and Mrs. Butler. He didn't try to change them. Maybe he didn't want to. The graciously run households of Crocus Hill and Summit Avenue were our essential clientele. I adopted Ollie's hauteur, taking a mean-spirited satisfaction in grabbing the first plant I saw on the floor when the low-end amateurs wheeled around, asking me to pick out the very best one. In the lunchroom, at coffee break, we disposed of this entreaty with withering contempt. "Mrs. B, would you be sure to pick out the very best donut for me over there in the box Vic brought in?" And Mrs. Butler would pantomime an exaggerated inspection of the donuts in the half-sheet bakery box, gazing intently, an expert's discerning frown on her brow, as her hand dipped and rose over the glazed zeros before her, until finally, "Ah, here it is," she cried, lifting the very best one aloft. No such fool, this Navy officer who strode toward me now. I could see that. He was handsome in a craggy, can-hold-his-alcohol way, modern somehow, not a man with the smooth matinee idol looks of my earnest father. He'd been around, you felt, had seen the world, been marked. It was part of the handsomeness. He came forward resolutely, a man with better things to do with his time, ready to hand over his gift list, ready to trust me with the details. I approached him without my order pad. Ollie and Mrs. Butler greeted their good customers like friends, for whom a purchase was somehow a given and yet also secondary. "How may I help you?" Another Ollie touch. Don't say, "May I help you?" Claim the next step. "How may I help you?" "I'm looking for a lot of roses," he said. I didn't blink. "Red?" I asked professionally. He looked at me, took me in for the first time, I think, as if I might be a tricky one. But this passed instantly. He smiled. A surprise and a charm, that radiant smile coming from that stern face. "Yes," he said right into my eyes. "Red. For Christmas." We had a small laugh over this meeting of minds. At this season, what other color could a rose possibly be? I led him to the display cooler, which wasn't the real cooler, that was in the basement, but the one meant to tempt people with possibilities. Slim pickings. Long-stemmed red roses stood upright as if at attention, 24 in a galvanized metal bucket. There wasn't much else left in the cooler, a few buckets of lemon leaf, wintergreens, holly, and cedar, and several branches of chartreuse cymbidium orchids slashed at the throat with maroon that would require the rare customer with daring taste. "Those," he said, pointing to the roses with the resolve I expected of him. Then he surprised me again. "Do you have any more?" I could look downstairs. "Do that," he said. But downstairs the designers wouldn't let me touch what was left in the big walk-in cooler. "There's still funerals to think of," they said, with the annoyance of people who have to remain at their posts no matter what crazy illusion the rest of the world is off to. Christmas or no Christmas, you had to keep some stock back for death, our bread and butter. "And you can forget about the greenhouse," they said as I went to the telephone. "They've been out since yesterday." "Then I'll take the orchids, too," the officer said when I went back upstairs. He checked his watch, looked toward the door. I told him it would only take a little longer while I wrote out the orders. While I was downstairs, he'd picked out 2 vases, big Waterford for the roses, narrow one for the orchids. He wanted everything sent to an address on Bayard, 2 separate packages, same name on each one, a woman's. I had to tell him there would be a delivery charge because it was so late. He shrugged. Fine. I knew he wouldn't care. But he was just getting started. A noble fir wreath and a tree, for heaven's sake, to the same address. I had to call the greenhouse about the tree. I explained to Charlie it was for an officer in the Navy who had just come home and was shopping late. Charlie, weary but willing, said he guessed so. I can hear his tired voice saying, "Just under the wire." Then the officer said he also had an FTD order. He fished in his trouser pocket and brought out a crumpled paper. California address, a woman's name he had to spell for me because it was Spanish. An officer in the Navy would naturally have someone with a foreign name waiting in a port city. Was Fresno on the coast? Again, he wanted roses, 3 dozen if possible, loose in a box. No arrangement. I understood perfectly. Arrangements were somehow domestic, but the instruction, loose in a box, was romantic, and I didn't have the word at the time, erotic. People sent arrangements on Mother's Day. They sent roses loose in a box on Valentine's. And the enclosure cards? Sign them all, Tom. Love on everything. We stood together at the big marble table while I wrote out the orders. As I copied the addresses from the order forms to the delivery slips, I asked him, out of politeness, what his rank was. He was checking his watch and looked up sharply. He didn't answer right away. In the Navy, I said, confused. Maybe rank was the word for the Army. Maybe the Navy had a different word. Maybe it was impolite to inquire. Oh, he said, captain. Nice to be home for Christmas, I offered, on leave. The lavish spenders like to make small talk. Yes, he said, great to be home on leave. I asked where his ship was. At this he didn't pause. San Diego, he said. San Diego. He said it twice. Then, I'm kind of in a rush. He was sorry to have to rush me, he said, but he had people waiting for him. He looked toward the door again. The holiday, you know, he said, smiling, that wonderful smile. The holidays are crazy, I said. We smiled into each other's faces, almost friends. And how would you like to pay? He gave the usual formula. Put it on our account, he said. You have the address right there. He pointed helpfully, reaching over the local delivery slips, grazing my hand with his own. Mrs. Thomas, he said, pointing to the last name and the address on Bayard. Ah, the wife. I smiled a sophisticated Ollie smile, thinking of the woman with the Spanish name in Fresno who was getting 3 dozen roses loose in a box to the wife's 2 arranged in a vase. Well, the wife was also getting the orchids and the Waterford, score even. And if California's out of roses? I asked at the last minute. Something nice, he said vaguely, the way all the best customers talk, trusting everything to us. He was already headed to the door. People were waiting for him. I thanked him. I added, sir. This apparently pleased him, because halfway to the door he turned as he pulled on his officer's hat and gave me a little salute and a final Robert Mitchum smile. The store was empty. The candy clerks had shrouded the long glass case and turned off the display lights. Ollie and Mrs. B were putting on their overshoes at their order desks behind the counter. Ollie called to me to lock the front door. My Navy officer I saw had gone across the street to Bullard Jewelers. He was peering in the door. He pounded on the glass. But I could see that the Bullard's cream satin windows were already vacant. He wouldn't get in under the wire at Bullard's as he had so luckily with us. Probably he was looking for diamonds, whether for the wife on Bayard or the Spanish woman on the coast. It was impossible to know. What surprised me when my father asked me to sit down at his desk in the basement office 2 weeks later was that I wasn't surprised, not really. Even before he explained, I saw it all. He was so patently phony, my best customer, so absolutely not an officer in the Navy or anything remotely military. That jacket, a joke. It came in sharp focus as my father pointed to the orders on his desk. The cuffs were frayed. The wool of the jacket was pilled, not even quite clean. The man's hair was too long. His blue wool tie strangled his reddish neck in a tight knob, and that salute as he left? Ridiculous. The hat's shiny visor was cracked, gray cardboard showing in the little split. It was a costume, not even a very good one. And his shoes? I hadn't looked at the shoes. I stayed with the face, the commanding smile, the Robert Mitchum sexiness. Why was all this so evident now? Why was I so easily hoodwinked at the time? I sat at my father's desk and looked at his face, which was really severe, not the mock sternness of the Navy officer broadly play-acting a big man. My father brought out a letter. It was from the man's mother, or rather, a letter from a lawyer representing the mother. Her address was the Bayard address, where the roses, the chartreuse orchids, the wreath, and the Christmas tree had been delivered. The letter included a copy of a public notice the woman had placed in the classifieds of the St. Paul Pioneer Press several years earlier, notifying anyone who cared to know that she, Mrs. Thomas so-and-so of whatever address on Bayard, hereby disavowed all responsibility for any debts or encumbrances incurred by her son, Thomas Jr., same last name, no known address, under any name or alias he might use from this day forward. Will she pay? I asked in horror. No, my father said, looking down at the orders. We can't ask her to pay. The Navy officer, I couldn't think of him as anything else, had skipped town. Fresno, I thought. As for the FTD order for the 3 dozen roses, we'll have to eat that too, my father said, a rare weariness in his voice. I'd been incredibly stupid. Yet he didn't scold, didn't admonish. There was no punishment, no demand or suggestion that I pay it all back out of my own wages. No sermon. I went upstairs to the showroom chastened, but apparently I wasn't in any trouble. All this would be swept under the rug of invoices and receipts, taken on the winds of remittances and debits that gusted through the business office in the basement. It would all just go away. But did I understand then? Or is it only possible now, in the middle of the night, of this last day, of this life as a daughter, to see in the great framed panels of memory how my father struggled, how trapped he was as he explained the situation to me? There he is, sitting miserably at his desk with the lavish orders before him. I've been an idiot, naive, so easily taken in, but he can say none of that. He, the great believer in the teaching moment, can use this experience to teach me nothing. That was his real misery, not the hundreds of dollars I had given away so easily. I wasn't Ollie or Mrs. Butler. I wasn't an employee who had made a terrible mistake and must be wised up. I was his girl, the girl he'd brought up to be, to remain always an innocent and eternal ingenue without guile or mistrust or even too many useful skills. No waitressing, no typing. Something better and more beautiful was awaiting me. Nothing bad could happen to me there in the store where he presided. I was free to trust everyone, everything. He didn't realize that the trust he bred in me, the trust he demanded, dragged in its communion-white innocence the deep shadow of adulthood where, eventually, I'd have to learn the score like everybody else. But admit it, I was already well on my way to being an ex-innocent. Worse, I was becoming a phony innocent, a pretend naïf. I'd seen it all, but I knew I wasn't supposed to see it. So I unsaw it. Didn't see the fakery, didn't see the scam, saw only the charm and happiness of the moment, the handsome man with the fabulous smile and a desire to give lavish gifts. It was what my father trained up in me, Miss Muffet on my flowery tuffet with a wee book of poesy. I was never to approach the world with narrowed eyes, never to be the one to get the better of anybody. I won't be a file clerk like Leo the Lion. I won't sit in a corner nursing Celtic grudges, keeping tabs on everybody. The romantic photograph, the one propped above the piano where I practiced under their lazy erotic gaze, is still only a still shot. In the movie that is our actual life, Their faces are different, or hers is, and not just because they're older. She learned to level the world with a strangely knowing mistrust, an ice chip of irony on her slouched shoulder. But my father wants me to stay as she was, caught in the romance of innocence. I'm never to morph from the romantic lead who leans with sweet dependence against him under a cottonwood tree along the Mississippi. Even as he swept the orders from his desk like a bad poker hand, my father said nothing. I wasn't in trouble. I couldn't be scolded. I was what he wanted me to be, his daughter, a truster in the lovely surface of things, another believer, his girl. How often he still comes back to me, my Navy officer. He appears at odd moments. He's here right now. Another snapshot I took without knowing it, his face shining at me on the big screen of the night black hospital window, winking his Robert Mitchum wink. He comes out of the cold from Fifth Street on Christmas Eve, striding across the showroom, the last customer of the holiday, my best customer ever. The laughable costume, the lavish smile, his final jaunty salute. Was that ever his lucky day? I was waiting for him. How may I help you? He didn't even need to do much acting. I made him up all on my own. Thank you. I want to liberate you to go out into the night and do what needs to be done out there, but I'm also here for those of you who would like to stay and talk. Let's just take a minute for people to, you don't have to slink away, just boldly walk out. That's just fine. Those of you who want to have a conversation, if you want to kind of come up closer now that some people have left for the real world out there, as we affectionately call it. It's really your turn. You don't feel you have to ask decorous questions. Any kind of protests or manifestos are welcome. You know, can you really... You know, the question is, how many drafts did this go through, the piece that I read, or, well, I sort of jumped around, but the parts that I read, and how much did it change? Is that right? You know, it's very hard for me to answer those questions since I've been working on a computer, because one doesn't have just a draft anymore. It's so easy to make changes that you probably, by the time you actually print something out to look at it, you've probably got something like 20 drafts. Only that's the first time you've taken it out as a whole. So it's very difficult, for me anyway, to talk about that in any genuine and honest and accurate way. I'm a big fiddler and fusser. I think you can tell that from how, you know, I mean, I like to make everything just feel as if it just came as if there were no drafts at all. And that, of course, takes a lot of time. I mean, I don't know if I succeeded here, but that's my, I like it to feel transparent. And so sometimes I have to cut things out that might be what I thought the first time around was good writing. It was just sort of showboating maybe, and it actually slows things down. And one thing that does happen in reading, because oftentimes I read stuff before it's published, you know, I'll read a passage, I will hear in the reading how I've gassed on too long or something, and then I will go back and make changes based on that. So I'm not able to exactly answer you, but I certainly do a lot of fussing around. That's for sure. In the spirit of making it look as if I just dashed it off. And the favorite thing I ever had said to me about this book, I told you that it all takes place on the night of my mother's death. I mean, there were, memoirs are funny things because they can't have a plot the way a novel does, but they have to make you want to keep turning the page, just like any single narrative does. And most of my books have had travelogues as the kind of line, that silver thread that you're pulling. But with this book about my mother and father, I mean, they didn't go anywhere. They were in St. Paul, and what would I do? And it was a very happy day for me when I realized, oh, I'll put it on that one night. And a woman came up to me after a reading and said, I can't believe you wrote that whole thing that night. And I thought, wait a minute, are you going to accuse me of being James Fry and lying to you? I mean, I thought it was pretty evident that this is a, artifice, but anyway. But it made me happy that she had been so kind of taken in that way. Not that I was trying to trick her, but just that she had lived so much within the shape of the piece. So, yes. Did you hear that? The question is the main character is of the thing is the naval officer, and did I have him as the main character, or did it evolve that he became the main character? I would say the part that evolved was not him. I knew I was going to write about him. I didn't understand why I was writing about him until I wrote the part at the end about what he meant. And this is one of the things about writing memoir that I think is quite enchanting for the memoirist anyway, maybe not so much for the reader, but is that so much fiction, and I happen to be right now reading Marilyn Robinson's new book, Home, which I love, and so I'm not talking about all fiction, but because I love that book. But a lot of fiction in the last, let's say, 50 years, certainly American fiction, has, the famous line is show, don't tell. And the idea is that you work by scenes. And what that does is the idea is to let the reader just see the action happening. But what happens is there's oftentimes, not in her book, and not in a lot of books, but there oftentimes is an absence of a consciousness. It's almost like the soul of the thing has been sucked out, and you can't figure out why these people are doing what they're doing. Why do I care? And in the 19th century, we really see that consciousness. We see let's say, even in Thackeray, who's a very, kind of social novelist, not a spiritual novelist, you see him coming in and saying, here, reader, I'm going to talk to you about stuff. You feel the consciousness. And, of course, in books like Jane Eyre and so forth, you feel the presence of the author. And I think one of the things that happens in memoir is that you get to show and tell. So that quality of bringing him in and having the scene, and you watch the scene and you see it, but you don't really know why you're watching this scene. I mean, it's sort of semi-interesting, but not that interesting. It's sort of, I drag it up. You begin to think, there's a reason I'm reading this. You begin to have an expectation of, there must be a reason I'm reading this, that you feel the quality of this girl being very innocent, and you kind of think, what's going to happen? And what happens, of course, is not simply that he proves to be a charlatan and I've gotten in trouble, but that as an adult, many, many, many years later, I look back on it and I'm able to re-inhabit it and understand. The main character then becomes my father, and it becomes his desire for the goodness of the world. And one of the things, sometimes when I read from a full-length book like this, I always want to say, well, we'll be locking the doors. They'll be bringing little cots in for you and meals. I mean, you don't know how to show how all the things connect to other parts. But this book is in a way about being a middle-class family in the middle of the country in the middle of the century. I'm not just interested about writing about myself. I'm interested in how this fits into something bigger. Otherwise, why would anybody want to read it? Except I wouldn't even want to read it. But I mean, why bother, sort of? And so one of the things I came to was that innocence, this kind of demand for innocence, was part of what that world was composed of. And so this scene fits into that. In fact, I think it begins by saying the history of innocence would be incomplete without this incident. And by that point, the reader already knows that there's this quality in the book. So that's really it.
She loses her innocence, but the father wants her to keep her innocence in some way.
And he keeps his throughout this book.
Yeah.
And so that's really what it's about. Now, did I know all of that when I started to write it? No. I just knew I was in possession of a hot potato of some sort. And so I wrote it to find out why it was a hot potato, you know? I don't know if that's the right image, hot potato, but I just knew. I mean, at a certain point in a book, I always make a grocery list of stuff I want to make sure is in it. And I can't remember if I'd already put this in or not, but if I hadn't, that would have been on my list of stuff that has to be fit in. Yes.
So when your mother criticizes you for being goody two-shoes,
Yeah.
is she obliquely criticizing your departed father for his being goody two-shoes, for his wanting that view of the world?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think, in the context of the whole book, I think it would be clear that she wasn't. No, at one point, my mother does become demented at a certain point, and she is sort of going in a very interesting, a kind of fascinating poetical way. And at a certain point when I came to visit her, as I did every day, and she would always say, well, here you are, finally. She forgot that I was there yesterday. And one time she said, I've been waiting for you all day, and, I've got something to tell you. Sometimes the children are really upset about this. And I said, well, she said, can I tell you? I said, well, shoot, what is it? And she said, well, I'm married. My dad, of course, is dead by this point. I married Don today. And I said, well, who's Don? And she said, well, he's the captain of this ship. And I said, oh, by this time I'm no longer trying to talk her down. And so I said, oh, well, is he rich? And she's very insulted by this, that I would be a gold digger like that. And she said, no, he's not rich. I said, well, is he nice? Oh, very nice. And then an imp got in me, and I said, nicer than Dad? And she said, we don't compare anyone with Stan. And I wrote that scene in this book. I mean, so that was the way she was. I can understand why you might think that from the bit I read, but again, it's in the context of the book, I don't think that would come up. Anybody else want to say anything? Or yes? I heard the beginning, but not the end. What made me what? Okay. How do I decide whether poetry or prose? Well, now I almost always just write prose, but so I won't answer as if I kind of go back and forth because I don't that much. But the way it happened was that I just had something I wanted to write about. In this case, it was my family's Czech family background on my father's side. My mother was Irish, my father Czech, and the Czech side was the part that really we grew up in. And I had written a poem about it, or two or three, but I realized that I had a bigger tiger by the tail, which I called inside my head before I had written the book, the lingering life of immigration. I knew I wanted to write about how people come over to this country. And remember, this is like 30 years ago. So, I mean, it doesn't sound that original now. Maybe it wasn't then, but at the time it wasn't. It was before, for instance, Alex Haley had written Roots and so forth. And I thought, I just want to write about that. My grandmother had lived with us, and she didn't write English, and I just wanted to talk about this lingering life of immigration as I thought, well, it became clear to me it was just bigger. I don't mean bigger, better. I just mean I needed a bigger canvas. I needed a bigger house to work with this. So it had to be prose. And I didn't understand I was writing something called a memoir. I really thought I was going to write a biography of her. And it's only later that I was informed that I had written something called a memoir. Which didn't please me because I've been brought up not to talk about myself, and I also believed if you were an artist, you should be able to make things from your imagination. So here I was doing something that I didn't really approve of exactly, but you do what you have to do when you feel you've got a project that you feel compelled to do. I mean, I quit my job. I went, as we used to say, behind the Iron Curtain to go to what was then Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was almost like sleepwalking. There was something in me that just had to write this book, but it was not going to be poetry because of the nature of the project. And once I did that, I liked working in big form, so I kept doing it. But to write a big form, you often have to write little bits and not know how they're going to connect, so you end up in the same mess that you are with poetry. You were going to say something? Yeah. Did you hear that? It's about that remark I made about the grocery list, and the question is, do I sometimes write something that wasn't on the list, and then it kind of throws everything into disarray, and it's gives a whole different view of the book or the project? Is that your question? Yeah, and sometimes I don't like that. I mean, all of the above. But when I say about that list, I didn't mean that I start a book usually by having a list. It's more after I can kind of see the shape of it and have more of it written. At that point, I begin to see where things could be fit in. And that's the point when I make the list. Because that's the point at which it's almost as if you were having a dinner party. You have to decide what you're going to be serving because you don't know whether you want to put rice on the list or potatoes. I mean, you have to already have a sense of the shape of the thing. And I'm not talking about an outline here. I'm talking about having written enough that I begin to see what the book is really about. And sometimes my idea of what a book will be is so vague that I have to write lots of odd pieces. Or sometimes I write a chapter that I don't even know where it belongs. For instance, the first chapter of Virgin Time, the Catholic book, is the first chapter I wrote is chapter 6 in the book. It comes in odd way. You have to kind of be patient with yourself and just stick with it. They talk about persistence being an important part of being a writer, and I think people sometimes think that means you wake up at 6, you have your cup of coffee, and you begin writing, bang, 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 and there's an element to that, but I think persistence really has to do with dealing not with success or continuing successfully to work, but how you deal with failure. That is to say, how you deal with the fact that things don't work or things aren't shaping up, and that you just kind of refuse to give up. Does that sort of answer the question? I'm not sure. Anybody else want to kick in here, say anything, ask anything? Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. Endings, how do you know when you're done? Well, there's there are different, of course, things, but it does have to do with rhythm. It has to do with, well, for example, the end of this book, which ends, as you know, because I told you, at the end of that night, but it doesn't really end at that night. My mother dies, I go home, and then at the end of the book, I go back to a memory of sitting with her at her nursing home at the end when she's floating in that floaty state that I described earlier. I made the decision that the end, how can I put this? You want, on the one hand, for the reader's expectations to be met, but also to be slightly jarred. So I didn't want to, even though I'm using that form of the evening, I don't want to end it with her death, because that is sort of, what? Obvious or somehow too kerplunk, And also, I guess just emotionally, I want her to still be alive at the end of the book. So she's dead, and I've done that, and then I bring her up again. And I wanted, and this has nothing to do with this book, it has to do with my desire to do a homage to Fitzgerald, who is mentioned in this book because Fitzgerald grew up and lived in the very neighborhood and block and street that I live on. And his presence is very much alive. I wanted the last lines of this book to be a homage. Nobody knows this except me. I mean, a homage to the last lines in Gatsby. So I wrote an ending that has that rhythm. I told you this thing. My mother thought she was on a ship, and we settled. The last line is, "We settled back in our deck chairs, just sat there side by side, taking in the bracing salt air, and faced without dismay the gauzy hinge between sea and sky, the limitless horizon dividing the elements, the disappearing point where we were headed." So I wanted the reader to have the feeling of the waves, dare I say, beating ceaselessly against the shore, born bass. And, it's just a little game for myself. It's not that I expect anybody to notice it. It's how I wanted it to be. And when I was writing a romantic education, I like to have a line I'm swimming toward in a great big book. And so I decided that the end of that book would be, I left the garden and went down into the city. Now, I'm not going to explain what that meant. I thought it was an absolutely brilliant idea on my part, that it combined all sorts of pieces of the puzzle of the book, and yet it had this simplicity of the end. And I thought, oh, this is so good. It's going to be so wonderful. Nobody ever mentioned it in any review, ever. But, it helped me get to the end, to know that line was over there for me to swim towards, to write towards, and so I did that. You can tell I enjoy the act of it all. I kind of have great success all by myself in my room. Yes, Brent.
You mentioned Fitzgerald. You're a Minnesotan. I'm a Minnesotan. Do you think of Fitzgerald as a Minnesotan novelist? Because I do. I think of his voice as being very Minnesotan.
Oh, my new best friend. I actually edited a book. You have just won a door prize. I'm going to say, I edited a book called The St. Paul Stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, which came out a couple years ago. And I edited it because I believe that, and also because I wanted to write a humdinger of an essay about Fitzgerald, and who was going to ask me? I'm not a Fitzgerald scholar, so I thought, I'll just do this book, and they have to put the essay at the front of it, and there it is. So, I make a really strong case for him, not so much Minnesotan, but St. Paul specifically, and that his whole obsession, his whole grudge, I guess I could say, about the rich has to do not with the south of France, not with New York, but with St. Paul society, which was highly hierarchical. And I certainly knew that myself, being on the service end of that society, and having that. It was a little bit like growing up, especially with the weather, in a Russian novel, because there were all these people giving these grand parties, and my father was decorating them. And then we were just, kind of creeping around the edges of it all. So I think Fitzgerald had that feeling too. I do. I think he brought that to all his other experiences, not that he came without that. And he says it himself, as you will read in my essay in the book, which I'm going to send you. I don't know if anybody else wants. You're afraid to ask me because I answer so long. I promise I'll just say yes or no. Yeah. What my writing schedule is. That's a very dangerous question. It depends on what I'm working on. I don't write every single day. I'm not like John Updike, 300 words a day or whatever it is. And who else had a wonderful, Graham Greene, what was it, 750? I have to get my 750, he'd say. I am project driven. So sometimes my writing time is given over to reading, note-taking. It depends on what I'm working on. And it's particularly difficult when I'm between projects going from one to the next to get myself launched into a project. And that's where I am right now. So I'm really looking forward to, shortly I'm going to be able to just write. And so I'll spend my day sort of, with interruptions and stuff. But that's how I like to do it. I'm kind of fast. I write fast, but I also write, once I get going, I have to write a lot. I have to write over and over again because my work is not very good to begin with. So, but sometimes I wish I were the kind of writer who could stand up and say, well, I sit down at 9 and I don't get up until 3 in the afternoon, and my wife brings me a sandwich at 12:30. It doesn't work that way. I'm making my husband's lunch for him, So, but, I seem to get the work done. Yeah. My next project, I've got a couple of things going, and I sometimes write for composers, and I just finished a piece, a text for the composer Alvin Singleton, which will receive its premiere in a couple weeks in New York, about a bit of American history called the Revolutionary War Prison Ships Martyrs, whom none of us had ever heard of, me anyway. Anybody here ever heard of the Revolutionary War Prison Ships Martyrs? No. It turns out it's one of the most important stories in our nation's founding, and it has to do with the British had 3 old hulks of battleships that they put out in New York Harbor, and they then turned them into floating concentration camps. And in those ships, they put young men and boys who they captured, mostly on other ships, often supply ships, and they then refused to repatriate them. They came from all over the world. These were idealists who had come when they heard about the American Revolution, and it was so thrilling to them to hear the values in the Declaration of Independence and Tom Paine's essays and pamphlets, that they came from all over the world, 150 countries. 11,000 of these boys and men died on these ships. They were not repatriated. Why? See if this sounds familiar to you. Because they were not considered enemy combatants. They were considered what? Terrorists. And so Walt Whitman in the 1840s, when he was the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle, wrote passionate letters, editorials, asking for a monument to be built because they buried these guys in the shallow sands of Brooklyn Harbor there, and their bones were washing up for decades after. In the 1840s, they were still coming up. Then the Civil War happened, and of course then the Whitman died, and the first monument was built in 1908. It came up, Sanford White, the great architect, designed it, and it fell into ruin again. And so on the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of that dedication, the monument has been rejiggered, and they asked Alvin Singleton, African-American composer who grew up in Bed-Stuy, to write choral work. And he asked me to write the text, and so I wrote something called Brooklyn Bones, and that will receive its premiere in a couple of weeks. I'm also facing two books. One is called The Art of the Wasted Day, which is about leisure and also going to be about, I think, Montaigne and the idea of essays and what it is to inquire of your own mind. And the other book is something called, it probably won't have this title in the end, but this is its working title, The Virtue of Heresy, which is a book I was invited to do as part of a work group, 7 writers working from the Institute for Lived Theology out of the University of Virginia. We meet every year in New York, and it's going to be a thing about why anybody would be loyal to an ancient, repressive, or orthodoxy. Sound familiar to anybody? And it's going to be about a priest friend of mine and me, and about travels we've taken together. So those 2 books, both short books. I say short, that means to tell me that they aren't going to be hard. But there is no such thing as a little book. And some fiction I have in mind. I've written some fiction, published a lot of short stories, but I've never collected them in a book. So that's it for me. You want to be liberated? Okay. Thank you ever so much.